Welcome to today's discussion. My guest is Steve Dabrowski, Principal for Cornerstone On Demand's Thought Leadership and Advisory Services. I'm your host, Jason Fornicola. Steve, welcome to the program today.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks for having me.
Steve, as the world of work continues to change and evolve, what's the impact on how government agencies approach talent management?
You know, as a former government employee, I actually had the firsthand experience in this. What's critical is as a government, we actually need to know that the world of work is actually changing. Currently, the who is changing. We have some say 5 generations in the workforce. How and what they do in the workforce is changing. The what is changing. The roles are changing. We're doing more with less. We haven't really bounced back from recession area job levels, and job descriptions actually have to be changed. The where we do the work is changing. We live in a global workforce. We can't be tied to the desk. The when is also changing. You know, we're seeing an interweaving of the work being done throughout the day, 24/7. And then the how. We also aren't so completely dependent upon sitting in front of your computer and getting the work done. We're using phones and tablets and devices to actually do the work 24/7 anywhere.
Yeah, I think the how and the when kind of get intertangled a little bit because of those technology advances and the capabilities that we have out there, right?
Exactly, yeah, and that's important for organizations to know. When we start talking about engagement, we really need to be focused on 3 things, right? And it's all in the effort to, I equate engagement to trust. We need to have organizations that are very familiar with their culture. They need to know who and how their workforce learns, works, what their needs are, their motivation. We need to know that the organizations need to be very clear and concise in their communications to demystify things that are scary to employees, change, transition, especially given the time that we're coming into where we're going to be having a change in the administration. It's critical that organizations communicate. And then lastly, it's very important for organizations to be very transparent. The why. Why are we doing this? Or here's a position and occupation. Here's how you get there. Here's the training that you need. Here are the resources that you need to get there, and we give you them. And so that transparency is also critical.
One of the things that you mentioned was doing more with less, which of course almost every industry is faced with, government, private sector, it doesn't really matter. But what is that impact on the government employee and their engagement level?
So I think it's really critical. So what we're seeing agencies become more and more proficient at is leveraging resources on staff. For example, instead of hiring contractors to do training or development, we look at alternative components like micro-learning or TED Talks or various subcomponents of those things, and then giving them the resources that they need to do the jobs when they need them, I think is critical in terms of doing more with less, and also making sure that we have that regular feedback, that there is this constant loop. You know, when we start to talk about performance management, we can't wait until the mid-year or the end of the year to give that feedback to the individuals, because if we're working them harder and they're not getting the feedback, they're going to become more and more engaged. And as millennials start coming into the workforce, we know one of their preferred learning styles or working styles is that they receive feedback back and forth. So it's instantaneous, it's relevant, and it's timely.
And I think to your point that you made earlier about some of these advances that we have and some of the technologies that are available where essentially people can be always on if they want to, that feedback should also be a part of that, right?
Exactly. And I think that there are tools that we can actually do. Here's the thing. We're doing a lot of this already in organizations. We just need to do it unified. We need to then take the data. Everyone has a learning management system in the government. Most are doing performance management. Some of them will be in paper, unfortunately. Some are doing succession planning in some shape or form. Most are doing workforce planning. So we're all doing that. The concept of doing them together and then taking that data and then making smarter decisions on that really drives the alignment for the organization and the individual, and make sure that we're making smarter decisions organizationally, therefore making a much more efficient government and agile.
Now, Steve, when you look at engagement and satisfaction and commitment, studies have shown that there's a gap between the public and private sectors. Can you talk specifically about that gap and maybe what can be done to close it a little bit?
Sure. One of the things that's critical when we start talking about employee engagement and the difference between public and private, and having had my feet in both areas, I see this pretty clearly because they also focus on engagement in the private sector as well. However, they take a different spin on it because it's not just limited to the work and the work-life balance, but it's everywhere. It's how and what you do the work. What is the actual communication pattern? Instead of employee integration, I think the next move is employee integration. How do we actually integrate the work into the employee and vice versa, right? So it just doesn't have that finite cap anymore. It's everywhere, and we have to allow that.
Yeah, and I think that probably speaks to your earlier comments about this changing world of work,
exactly.
right? And the different world that we live in that maybe we used to years ago.
Right, and what's happened in agencies a lot of times is that barrier that happens with the fear of risk. No one wants to end up on the front of the paper as doing something incorrectly or taking a risk that didn't pan out. So it stifles innovation. So we need to be aware of that and try to mitigate it as best as possible. And when we start talking talent management and engagement, I think there are three critical organizations in any organization that we need to engage. And that's the Chief Information Officer, it's a Chief Human Capital Officer, and it's the Chief Learning Officer. And I think those three combined. And then also potentially the Chief Financial Officer as well in terms of funding. And aligning those four individuals and those four organizations will help shape a strategy for talent management that is in line with the organization mission and help the overall employee engagement drive up.
Now, Steve, you do have experience in both the public and private sectors, so I want to ask you here maybe what you have seen in the private sector that could be applied to the public sector, because as we know, there are some unique challenges being a government employee.
You know, and here's the thing, for the longest time in the federal government, I thought, well, we're just so unique, the federal government, we just have all these requirements and these things that we do. And yes, there are policies and processes that we have to follow and regulations that we have to follow, but they're no different than any other industry. We work in Cornerstone, we work with a number of individual industries, banking. I mean, I did work with an airplane manufacturer. I mean, imagine the regulations surrounding these individual organizations, no different than the regulations that a government agency faces. What they're doing differently is they're innovating. They're putting the resources that they need to put in the locations that they need to be and giving them the support that they need to foster creativity and control for the risk, right? So don't let the fear constrain you or restrict you. Do it and innovate, but do it in a controlled manner, if that makes sense.
Of course. Some government agencies have seen their employee engagement scores rise. What's behind that?
I think a lot of the rising engagement scores are, the engagement becomes more and more important for agencies nowadays. I think you see engagement commitments, and like in senior leaders, like the Chief Human Capital Officer likely has a goal in her performance review or his performance review saying that this agency's engagement score must go up a certain percent, or I have to take an engagement action plan and build out something, and they're reviewed on that, and that's very serious. And so you're seeing agencies taking it a lot more serious. But we have other agencies like transportation and housing and urban development that are participate in OPM's federal coaching network and engaged in an interagency rotation program where we're not necessarily increasing the cost, but we're using internal resources to drive that innovation, share and collaborate, and allow for creativity to happen across the borders.
How important is it to tie agency mission to an individual's performance goals?
I think it's critical that an employee needs to feel that the work that they're doing makes a difference, and the easiest way to do that is aligning with the actual organizational mission. And that's two things. One, it's the individual needs to know it, and the organization needs to know it and communicate it. And so those are two critical dependencies that often or sometimes don't get done. One might be done the other. And what happens if you're not aligned, people leave. We're finding that if there isn't that buy-in to what we're doing as a mission, that the employee then will depart or take another position somewhere else.
And I imagine on the flip side, if they are aligned, that can be very powerful and can almost have exponential benefits.
Extremely.
Right. Are there any examples that you can think of where maybe that's happened?
I can think of one. I remember a supervisor of mine talking about how important it was to be aligned to the organizational mission. They were conducting a survey. They asked a fellow janitor at NASA, and what is it that you do? And his response amazed the respondent, or the survey taker. He said, "I put people on the moon." And he's like, well, you're a janitor. No, I put people on the moon. It's literally every individual contributing to the overall success of that mission. And that is a really solid example of when you get it, you're in, and it's powerful.
Right, that's a really engaged employee.
Right.
Yeah. So what would your recommendations be for the federal government to increase engagement and commitment and satisfaction?
I think it's critical when we start talking about engagement and satisfaction that we leverage the resources that we have. We have resources on staff that we could be used in different ways. So as we talked about, bringing training inside, making sure that the opportunities are communicated. What's clear is that training and development opportunities are a key driver of engagement, and agencies that communicate them, make them transparent, unify them with other components, and then allow for creativity. Other avenues, mobile. And the other big thing that's coming with learning and development is social and collaborative learning. It is the ability to communicate. We as a society like to talk and share things. That's, I think, the secret behind Facebook and Instagram and all the stuff that's going on where we're sharing and we're collaborating. Giving the individual employees the power to do that and take control of their learning and development and their careers is really powerful and will lead to greater engagement.
So what is the future of employee engagement in this effort to focus on human capital issues, particularly in the federal government, where there are a number of mission-driven employees, I would say. You would find that also in the private sector, but when you're aligning with these missions, that's a very powerful thing for an employee to get behind. Talk about that, also how technology fits in with that.
So I think that you're seeing technology come up and enable folks to interact and engage independent of being behind the company firewall or the organization firewall. So oftentimes what we have is this constraint because of fear of security or privacy concerns. And what we're seeing now and again are agencies like GSA putting out federal requirements for systems like FedRAMP, and that then take that burden off of the individual agencies to make sure that this technology is safe to use, right? So then that enables stuff like mobile learning, mobile performance reviews. You're not often connected to internet, so can you take it offline and do your work? I think it's what we're seeing is the bleeding of the lines between here's work and here's life, and people are demanding that. Where we do the work, how we do the work, and when we do the work are three critical factors that are going to be important in determining how successful government agencies are able to recruit that staff that's coming in. In 2020, millennials are going to represent 50% of our population, our workforce population. In 2025, they're 75%. The way that they learn, the way that they interact, and the way that they engage is likely not different than what our current employees want and need. And so we need to pay attention to those things and making sure that we're implementing those strategies to do that. We can certainly leverage and empower it by the technology that we choose, but also being aware of kind of the processes that we do. It's not enough to just implement technologies and automate workflows. It's take this process and make it in this computer or this mobile. We really need to be innovative and think about what makes the most amount of sense and do it in that way.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point. There is a demand for that, particularly on the side of millennials, not only in their personal lives, but in their work lives as well. They come to work and they expect the same technologies that they use in their personal lives.
They don't care how it works or how it happens. They want it there and they expect it. It's no longer a would be nice to have, it's a must have.
Sure.
You're seeing programs like bring your own devices that agencies are leveraging, which are great for agency in reducing the cost. But it also allows the employees to be connected a lot more. They aren't having to carry the BlackBerry or the work device around with them. They actually have their own device and they can flip back and forth between work. I think it's becoming more and more prevalent.
A great conversation, Steve, as we close out here today. What are your final thoughts?
I think there's a lot of innovation in the workforce. What's really comforting is that there are a lot of good people in the government and they're paying attention and they get it now. The talent management component leading to a greater engaged workforce is really starting to take get energy underneath it, and it's becoming really critical, and it's a key driver to employee engagement and satisfaction.
I'd like to thank my guest today, Steve Dabrowski. He is a principal with Cornerstone On Demand's Thought Leadership and Advisory Services. For Federal News Radio, I'm Jason Fornicola.